Welcome students, alumni, faculty, and staff. For our next panel in the American Dream Reconsidered, in our fourth year of offering this program. Now, this panel tonight is about a very significant issue, voter rights and voter suppression. So in recent years, you have noticed that voter ID laws and partisan gerrymandering have degraded the quality of the American democracy, excluding millions of our citizens from our electoral processes. This panel will ask and debate very difficult questions about how to move forward to regain the full voting power for all Americans. So tonight's session will be moderated by Dr. David Faris, Associate Professor of Political Science at Roosevelt University. His scholarly work focuses on electoral institutions, party politics, and foreign policy. He's also the author of It's Time to Fight Dirty: How Democrats Can Build a Lasting Majority in American Politics. With that, please welcome David Faris, who will introduce our guests. David?
Good evening, everyone. So glad you could join us here for this important panel in our fourth annual American Dream Reconsidered conference. As I did last year, I wanted to take a moment to thank members of the Roosevelt community who helped to make this amazing conference happen. I particularly wanted to thank Vanessa George, Executive Assistant to the President, Michael Ford, Chief of Staff to the President, Nicole Barron, Vice President of Marketing and Communication, Keturah Brown, Director of Conference Services and Special Events, and Amanda Gable, Director of Creative Services, as well as Professor Emeritus, University Historian, and former Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Lynn Weiner, for their tireless efforts to make everything that you're seeing here this week run smoothly. So please join me in a round of applause for all of the work that they've done. We are in the midst of a period of renewed focus and attention on voting in the United States and the way that we often fall short of a vision of equal access and full equality in voting rights. Those shortcomings have become particularly apparent during close elections and as polarization has heightened the perceived stakes of elections all around the country. And so we are so lucky to have with us tonight two experts who approach the subject from different directions. We'll be having about a 45 to 60-minute panel discussion, followed by about 15 to 20 minutes of questions from you, the audience, before we adjourn at 6:15. And so I would like to introduce our panelists to you. David Daley is the former editor-in-chief of Salon, and he is the author, most recently, of the very influential book that I thought for a very long time about how to say this, but it's called Ratf, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count. And it is a book that really influenced the conversation about redistricting and mapping in the country. He is a senior fellow at the nonpartisan organization FairVote, and his journalism on voting rights, gerrymandering, and democracy issues has appeared in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Slate, The Guardian, and The New Republic, among many other places. And just this week, I'm sure you saw the story, he helped blow open the North Carolina gerrymandering story for The New Yorker. Ami Gandhi is an attorney and the director of voting rights and civic empowerment at the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. She works to reduce barriers to voting and improve civic participation, especially in communities of color and low-income communities. She has led statewide voter protection and partnered with community members in the criminal justice system to expand voter access. She advocated for communities of color during Illinois redistricting and advised local election boards on implementing the country's first Hindi ballots. She also previously served as the executive director of the South Asian American Policy and Research Institute. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists tonight. Sorry, back to the mic. David and Ami, I'm going to turn it over to you now for your opening remarks, and just kind of hope that you can give us the state of play in the areas where you focus on and you have the most expertise, and we'll start with Ami.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and it's phenomenal to get to join with other voices on the stage and in the audience, and really looking forward to this evening's conversation. I'm Ami, and I'm with Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and I wanted to provide a snapshot of the kind of work our organization does so that you can get an idea of the lens through which I am going to share my ideas with you this evening. As David mentioned, we protect voters' rights by answering voters' questions in person at polling places across the region, answering questions over the phone to our hotline, 866-OUR-VOTE, helping voters in Cook County Jail. On a more systemic level, what we do is we take the data and stories from community members, from their experiences in voting, and we use that to push for more systemic level solutions, hopefully, to improve our voting system overall, including we serve as the lead counsel for the nonpartisan Just Democracy organization, Just Democracy Coalition here in Illinois, in our efforts to enforce the state's automatic voter registration laws. And I'll be talking about automatic voter registration a little bit later this evening. And especially because in Illinois, the racial gap in voter registration rates is worse than the average that we see in the United States, we think that it's essential to try to reduce the unnecessary bureaucratic barriers to voter registration for all eligible voters. We also partner with community members on a number of different initiatives to expand voter access for communities in the criminal justice system, including people in jail and pretrial detention who have not been convicted of anything and often are in jail because of financial inability to pay bail, who have voting rights on paper, but in practice, there's not a way to get to a polling place, so there's definitely a need for a lot of improvement in that context. We also served as legal counsel to incarcerated community members who wrote and passed a bill this year to require Illinois prisons and juvenile justice facilities statewide to provide civics education that's peer-led on the inside for people soon to be released so that citizens can learn how to go about reclaiming their voting rights once they're out. And we have one of the reasons that I really appreciate working in the civil rights context where we put race first and talk about it explicitly is because we think that voting is important not just for the sake of voting, not just for the sake of election day, but because of the ripple effects that it's going to have on the rest of our lives on issues like housing and education access and all of that gets determined by who is in power and who gets to have a say. On a personal level, I am the daughter of immigrants and a first-generation voter, and even with a lot of the relative privilege that I hold, I've been told to go back to where I came from outside a polling place, and I want to do everything I can to try to address those kinds of instances that come up for other people, far too many people, even in Illinois, even in Chicago. I wanted to share in closing some of my observations about the state of play of the voting rights landscape right now. And I think that we have some of the best insights possible on policy ideas for how to improve our system from people who are most directly affected. And we've seen that in movements that have been successful and that are still in progress in places like far away like Florida and also right at home here in Illinois. And these are among the most engaged and astute citizens that we could find in terms of really hearing smart ideas about how to move our system in a better direction and protect the voting rights of everyone, no matter who they support. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for being part of this conversation. The state of play is frankly terrifying in many ways. There are days in which it feels as if what we are watching is the slow motion unraveling of American democracy right before our very eyes. This is a far cry from what we all thought would happen 11 years ago, when right across the street from this very university in Grant Park, the nation celebrated the election of its first black president, and commenters on television of all stripes and partisanship across the cable news dial talked about how changing American demographics were going to change the very nature of politics in this country for a long time to come. It did not exactly turn out that way. And the reason it didn't turn out that way is because while Democrats celebrated this tremendous historic victory, Republicans got right back to work. And what they realized is that as historic a year as 2008 was, 2010 had the possibility to be even more historic, because 2010 is a census year. And what happens after the census the following year is that the state legislatures that are elected redraw all of our state legislative and congressional districts. The party that won in 2010, not the party that won in 2008, would be in control of drawing district lines that we would have to fight all of our elections on for the next decade. The Republican Party launched a $30 million plan called REDMAP, that's short for the Redistricting Majority Project. And what that did, while Democrats fell asleep on the importance of the 2010 elections, especially down ballot, Republicans went in and they captured state legislatures in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, and they were able to redraw the districts for those state legislatures and for Congress in such a way that in 2012, the first election held under these maps, Democratic candidates nationwide get 1.4 million votes for the US House. Republicans take the chamber 234-201. Now, as we know, there's not a lot of elections in this country done by popular vote, especially for the US House, except that is a real anomaly in the history of the country. Usually the party with the most votes wins the most seats. But as you may have also noticed over the course of this last decade, that has not been what's happening in our state legislatures either. This is an era of deep-seated minority rule. In the state of Wisconsin, in 2018, Democrats win the assembly vote by 200,000. They win 36 of 99 seats. In Michigan, the Democrats have won the statewide popular vote for the state house 2012, 2014, 2016, 2018. They have never taken more seats in Michigan State House. It's the same in North Carolina. It's the same in Ohio. There are, right now, 59 million Americans living in a state in which the legislature is controlled, either one branch or both branches, by the party that got fewer votes in the previous election. This is a shocking and undemocratic result. There was a big Democratic wave in 2018. Democrats did manage to take back the US House, sweeping suburban districts in states like Kansas, like Oklahoma. They added on a lot of wins in California, in New York. They were able to win in states like Pennsylvania, Florida, and Virginia because of new districts that were mandated when these maps were overturned as either racial or partisan gerrymanders. But there was no change in any of these other states, in Wisconsin, Ohio, North Carolina. These lines have held. These lines have not budged. What gerrymandering does, essentially, is insulate politicians from voters. It entrenches a party in power, and it debases fair elections and free results. The United States Supreme Court back in June slammed the door to the federal courts on partisan gerrymandering claims. They opened the door to essentially unfettered festivals of partisan gerrymandering happening after 2020, when we do this all over again in 2021. There is some good news. There is a path through state courts in Pennsylvania, in North Carolina, Supreme Courts interpreting state constitutions on fair and open and free elections have struck down maps as unconstitutional. The bad news is that, as we see right now in North Carolina, where they are working on a new map, they are not exactly following court orders. There's been good news in that referendums in Colorado and Missouri and Michigan and Utah have tried to take the process of drawing district lines away from partisans and give it back to the people. The legislatures in many of those states have then worked to override the will of the people. So this is a very complicated moment, and in many ways, we are sitting at a very real tipping point for the importance of the side with the most votes actually being able to enact an agenda.
Well, thank you both. So let's get into it. I mean, how is the struggle to protect an individual's right to vote so critical to the practice of democracy in the United States? And I guess where do you see the most potential for new protections and laws to ensure that all Americans have equal and unimpeded access to the ballot?
Our democracy was set up from the outset to not necessarily be entirely democratic and to exclude particular people from the system. So I think we have to take a real look at that history when we try to move forward and fix the current and very entrenched problems. When we've had large groups of community members intentionally excluded, for example, the advent of our voter registration system in itself drawn in a way to exclude recently freed slaves in the South, immigrant citizens in the North, women and low-income community members nationwide. When we have systems like our voter registration system, we can't take for granted that that's the way it has to be. And that probably applies to redistricting and many other facets of our democracy as well. But we have to challenge our assumptions about how our system needs to be in order to make a fruitful change. And one of the great opportunities that we see and that I see is to modernize and in some cases do away with some of the vestiges of our archaic voter registration systems. When we have millions more people in Illinois, for example, who are eligible to vote compared to those who went through the bureaucratic steps to get on the rolls to be able to actually vote, we have a problem. And that disparity is even greater in some other parts of the country. We're lucky that we have systems here like election day registration, online voter registration, automatic voter registration, which is in the early and flawed stages of implementation here. But the concept makes sense okay, if you're eligible, there should be a way to exercise your right to vote, whether you had the rules memorized ahead of time or not. I see the difference, for example, when we answer calls from Illinois and Indiana during every election, and we see the difference when voters call us from Illinois where there are these different registration innovations in place. And if they're eligible, even if they haven't gone through all the hoops before, they can find a way to get registered and it can be the difference between whether they can vote that day or not. Whereas it's a much more disappointing answer that we have to give to someone who calls us on election day from Indiana. And no shade to Indiana, that's my home state. And there are a lot of great things about it, and that's why it upsets me all the more when people who are fully eligible to vote can't exercise the right to vote. The concept behind automatic voter registration should be hopefully a straightforward one that will be more of a trend across the country. We have it in several states, but not that many yet, and Illinois signed it into law a couple years ago. It hasn't become a reality yet, unfortunately, but the idea is if we're giving our already verified personal information to government agencies and they know everything about us already and they know enough information about whether we're eligible or not, we've provided proof of that, why not have us added to the voter rolls at that time? As I had mentioned before, it stands to really help close the racial gap that we see in voter registration. And what could be the good reason to not have systems like that in place that would also clean up the voter rolls and if you want to say it this way, it would prevent the minuscule amount of voter fraud that happens. It would be a good innovation that all of us should be able to agree on. Places like Illinois, we agreed in theory that that should be the law of the land, but then in practice it's another story, and unfortunately the enforcement and implementation has been slow. But I mean, this is 2019, there have to be better ways of doing things to keep our system up to date.
We should really have a whole separate panel about implementing policy when it's passed into law, because it's really fascinating to me. David, so your work is more focused on who we get to vote for, right, rather than who gets to vote. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the laws in the United States around districting itself differ from those in other countries, and why it's so problematic that, as you wrote in your book, the politicians in the United States, in many states, get to pick their own voters.
We are essentially the only democracy in the world that allows our politicians to pick their own voters, draw their own lines, and essentially determine winners and losers. If you look around the world, just about every other modern democracy has found a better way to do it than us. I mean, most democracies do not use our single district winner take all. So they essentially have their representatives elected from larger districts, and there are more of them in each district. And that means that the individual boundaries matter less. It is harder to sort of, play games with the lines in order to try to lock in an advantage for yourself. Many other countries use really neutral commissions, or they're commissions in which essentially everybody has a seat at the table. If you look at New Zealand, they essentially invite every major and minor party into the room, and they have a conversation about line drawing. In England, it's something called the Boundary Commission. It's a very boring name, but it's a very important job. And it is a very technical process. And those lines go to Parliament, but it is for essentially an up or down vote. They're not able to change the lines, and usually nothing happens except they are ratified and introduced. It's a similar process in Mexico, in which there is a statistical board, trusted, neutral, nonpartisan technicians who use an algorithm to come up with lines. There are set standards, and the politicians in Mexico are only allowed to change those lines if the changes that they make actually improve the districts according to those neutral, nonpartisan criteria. I mean, France really is the only country that does something similar to us as far as allowing the executive branch there to draw the districts, except even there it has to go through a constitutional council. And it is done at the national level. It's not every single state drawing up their own individual lines in each state. What we are doing in many ways, I fear, is creating a democracy desert in which there are going to be states that have all of these terrific laws that we are talking about today, like automatic voter registration. And then there are going to be states that simply don't. And there are going to be states that do a neutral, nonpartisan job of drawing lines where it's enforced by the courts. And then there are going to be states where the Supreme Courts are more partisan and they're going to act in a different way. So what we need to do, I think, is think in a very big and very creative way as far as trying to fix these big structural problems. We do, however, have amazing examples all around the world of folks who are able to get this job done in a manner better than we have.
Thanks. I was hoping that you could address some recent developments in everyone's favorite state of Florida. Last year, in the blue wave, voters passed a constitutional amendment restoring voting rights to formerly incarcerated community members in the state of Florida, only to then see the Republican legislature place new, seemingly financial restrictions on restoring those rights. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what's happening there now, whether you see a way forward in Florida and in other states that have these kinds of laws about people convicted of crimes, you know, what do you think? What do you see happening sort of nationally, both in Florida and nationally around this issue?
Definitely see a way forward because people who are currently or formerly incarcerated are really leading the movement locally and nationally to make a very necessary change in this space. It's heartening that this question is coming up here and that there have been changes in Florida and elsewhere. The momentum is definitely moving in a direction of change. I want to provide a little bit of a chronology of the events in Florida in case people need a recap. In November, as you mentioned, 64% of Florida voters passed Amendment 4, a historic ballot initiative that amended their state constitution to restore voting rights to people convicted of most felonies once they've completed their sentences. It restored voting rights to 1.4 million returning citizens with a past felony conviction, and it was billed as the single largest expansion of voting rights in the US since the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18 back in 1971. And fast forwarding to several months later, the Florida legislature then passed a bill signed by Governor Ron DeSantis punishing people based on their wealth by forcing those convicted of felonies, the same group of future voters we were talking about, to repay all fines, fees, and other monetary penalties associated with their convictions or face disenfranchisement. The recently passed law disproportionately impacts Black community members in Florida who have a felony conviction and who face the intersecting barriers of accessing jobs in a state with longstanding wealth and employment disparities. And a lot of this information I'm pulling from the Brennan Center, ACLU of Florida, and other folks who are leading this fight in Florida. So even though hundreds of thousands of people in Florida are now technically able to vote who weren't able to vote before, there are many more who simply need support, of usually a pretty modest amount of financial support. We're talking about hundreds of dollars, not some other kind of scheme that's involved here. And advocates on the ground, like the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, which led the effort to pass the Amendment 4 in the first place last fall, are now working on full implementation of the law with a few different important tools. For example, they launched a fund to try to help people close that gap and pay the fines and fees needed under this newer passed law so that they will be able to vote. And there's also been an important legal challenge to the Republican passed law filed by the ACLU, NAACP, Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and Brennan Center. And so we definitely see hope on the horizon because advocates are ready to pounce and have on the legal injustices in how that's played out in Florida compared to the will of the people in November. Closer to home in Illinois, and this is the theme of my remarks tonight and in life, is that we look good on paper here. We if you look at a map of voting rights across the country, we often have all these compliments attributed to Illinois, and we look like we're progressive, and we are in some very important ways. And at the same time, there is not necessarily automatic restoration in the way that I understand that term once people have left prison, even in Illinois. People are eligible to reclaim their rights, but have to go through a lot of bureaucratic hoops to do that, such that only a fraction of formerly incarcerated community members actually end up knowing that they're registered, going through the procedural steps to get registered. So we still got to improve even closer to home. Thankfully, with reforms like those we've seen in recent months in places like Illinois, there is hope on the horizon. Community members led an effort to draft and pass a bill requiring civics education in prison. Like I shared earlier, we actually have one of the the thought leaders and important advocates for that work in the room today, Professor Christina Rivers of DePaul University, who has done tremendous work with, again, community members most directly affected to leverage their ideas for the kinds of policy changes that we need to see. We have another recently signed bill in Illinois, a new law in Illinois that requires greater access for community members in jail and pretrial detention. The only difference between them as an eligible voter and me is that they have the financial inability to pay bail, and then they're excluded from the polls as a result. So there are lots of innovative models and trends that I hope spread in more places. I completely agree with you, David, that it shouldn't be so different in terms of which side of the state line you're on and then what your fate is when you're an eligible voter simply trying to make your way through the bureaucracy and exercise your right to vote. There is a lot of variation, unfortunately, but it also means that there's a lot of different laboratories for innovation that's happening that I hope some of these trends spread, particularly if we listen to the good ideas of people who have been in their shoes and who have faced those issues in a real life way. I think we're going to get the best policy ideas from them.
Thank you. David, I was hoping that you could describe for us what's happening in North Carolina right now.
I already titled my book.
I mean, I guess more specifically, how recent news out of North Carolina about the state legislative maps link back to the last round of redistricting after the 2010 census, why your sort of recent discoveries about how those maps were drawn were so explosive, and why what's happening so far away in North Carolina has such significant implications for the United States as a whole in terms of our voting rights.
Sure. Let me just say first that what happened in Florida happens in many ways because of a gerrymandered legislature. When you have a gerrymandered legislature, they feel completely safe overriding the will of 64% of the people just the previous November. That's 64% of the people. That's, it's an awful lot. In a year in which Florida elects a Republican governor or a Republican senator, it means that this is not seen as a partisan issue. It's seen as an issue of basic fairness and equity. And a gerrymandered legislature doesn't feel like it has to listen to the people at all. And that is what we have in North Carolina. In North Carolina, there was a study out of Harvard. They do kind of an international election comparison. And they decided that they would throw North Carolina in and compare it to countries around the world, and it fell short of Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran as far as basic electoral protections, the right to vote, the integrity of electoral boundaries. Things are not particularly good in the state of North Carolina. We saw this in 2018. A majority of voters prefer Democratic candidates for both the state house and the state senate. Republicans win 58% of the state senate seats, 54% of the state house seats. All Democrats were able to do with a majority of votes was break a supermajority held by the side that got fewer votes. It's a very dangerous situation. It has been ground zero this entire decade in the fight against both partisan and racial gerrymandering. The state legislative maps, as well as the congressional maps, have been overturned and redrawn and challenged and overturned again and again and again by a legislature that has refused to honor the intent of court wishes and court rulings to draw fair maps that ensure that the side with the most votes wins instead of the side that the map maker prefers. And while the entire congressional map, which had been thrown out by a bipartisan panel of federal judges last year, went to the Supreme Court and was overturned in that June ruling that essentially slammed the doors of the federal courthouses to partisan gerrymandering claims. the Supreme Court did allow state constitutional challenges to continue. And so in July, there was a trial in North Carolina State Court about the state legislative map. And just last week, that map was called an unconstitutional partisan gerrymander. The court was, again, a bipartisan court, judges appointed by governors of all different parties, was furious that it's 2019 and the voters in North Carolina are still voting on unconstitutional maps that they've been living under for the last decade. Essentially, legislators in North Carolina have been able to vote and pass laws that affect people without the proper protections of a constitutional district. And they gave them 2 weeks, essentially, to draw fair districts, and they said, you've got to do it all in public. I don't want to see a single thing done behind closed doors. And we have seen, the last couple of days, what's playing out down in North Carolina, in which they are still trying to do everything that they can to smuggle partisanship into these maps. The man who is most responsible for the state of North Carolina is a map maker named Thomas Hoffler. The piece that David's referring to, I came into about $100,000, excuse me, I did not come into $100,000. I came into about 100,000 documents, if only, that sort of showed how he did this. And those documents were crucial earlier in the year to essentially knocking the citizenship question off of the US Census. But what the documents I wrote about this week show is just the precise amount of racial and other demographic data that went into the drawing of these lines in North Carolina. And I think the best example really is what happened in Greensboro. You may be familiar with North Carolina A&T University in Greensboro. It's the oldest historically black university in the nation. And there is a district line that runs straight through the campus there in Greensboro. It's so precise that there are 7 dorms on one side and there are 6 dorms on the other side. And as a result, this majority black city is represented by 2 of the most conservative Republicans in Congress, because the votes of minorities in Greensboro are cracked and diluted by this district line. Republicans have long said, oh, that's just a precinct boundary. We didn't mean anything by this. Some of the things that I found in this cache of documents include a database of every single college student in the state of North Carolina by address, by date of voter registration, by which elections those voters had taken part in, and also, does that voter have a driver's license? And that matters because this gerrymandered legislature in North Carolina had enacted a voter ID bill just the year before that said if you don't have a driver's license, you're not eligible to vote. And they did this because they took a previous survey and they said, what form of ID are students and African Americans least likely to have? And it came back driver's license. So all of this data is in Thomas Hoffler's computer as he is drawing these lines. You see the color-coded maps that break down the city of Greensboro. And one of these maps, and I'll end on this, is actually called Greensboro Master Race. This is how surgical and precise these lines are drawn. We've got to take this power away from Thomas Hoffler and give it back to all of us.
That was a little depressing, David. I just have to say.
I come with my own black cloud.
Right. I mean, as someone who works on the ground with voter protection efforts, I kind of wanted to ask you, what can members of our audience tonight do to advance the cause of voting rights, both here in Illinois and then elsewhere in other states around the country?
Please remember our hotline number. If you remember nothing else about what I said this evening, we have a phone number, 866-OUR-VOTE, O-U-R-V-O-T-E, that people can call any time of year, but you can imagine that we get the most volume of calls during election time. And we literally have a call center in downtown Chicago and many other places where we're happy to help people real time to get issues addressed, to be in problem-solving mode, advocate to election officials so that it can be the difference between whether someone is able to vote or not, answer any questions they may have. There are also accompanying lines in other languages for community members who are not comfortable in English. So again, 866-OUR-VOTE. But I also, beyond giving you the advertisement for our phone number, I want to talk about redistricting a little bit, because I really encourage people to dig into these issues that obviously you're all here. This issue interests and fascinates you. We're getting to learn insights from experts here tonight. And I think that people's input, voters' input, community members' input on our redistricting system is absolutely needed. On a little bit of a tangent, I'm reflecting on here in Illinois, where we've been at an impasse for a long time about not having changed our redistricting system yet, even though there's a need for it. I think all of us on all different ends of political spectrum would agree that our redistricting system is broken for the reasons that you really effectively laid out. And it's not the same it's not the same exact problem in Illinois as far as what kinds of harms the flaws cause and that the people in power cause. So I don't want to suggest that there's some kind of equivalence, but does corruption and improper concentration of power affect people's real lives in Illinois and Chicago? Absolutely. Some of the worst voter intimidation that we hear about is during very, very local municipal elections here that are probably not getting covered by any national news outlets or even that many local news outlets, but that really are some of the ugliest forms of exclusion from the polls that you might see. And that's all people within the same party, largely, who are fighting each other. So I think we have a lot of work to do even right here at home in terms of improving our redistricting system. And I really hope for people to get directly involved in voicing what kind of reimagined system might you want to see. I think some of the reason for the impasse in Illinois has been because not enough people have been engaged, perhaps by design, but it's somewhat on all of us to get engaged in these processes and envision what kind of improved system do we want to see. Because I think we could all probably agree that the current system is broken, even if we have some healthy differences of opinion about what it would take to fix it.
Thank you. So I was just reading the other day that apparently there's an election next year. So so weird. David, I was wondering how you see the struggle against gerrymandering shaping up after the next census, which is we're heading into a census year. Have the legal challenges to these maps in Pennsylvania and North Carolina in particular, and then ballot initiatives in places like Michigan, have they made it more difficult for parties to engage in partisan gerrymandering? Have they changed the incentives for lawmakers? Are people like, are the map makers running scared? Are they hiding their emails? Has the incentive structure really been changed in a meaningful way? Or does the Supreme Court's recent refusal to end the practice altogether sort of invite further mischief?
Yes. I think yes to all of that. I think that more Americans than ever are aware of the importance of these district lines, and as we head into another redistricting cycle, this is not going to be allowed to be conducted in the shadows again. I think the Democrats are more prepared for 2020 than they were for 2010. They understand the importance of down-ballot races and state legislatures, I think in a way that perhaps went missing in a decade ago. There's a real opportunity through state courts to help fix this problem. 49 of 50 state constitutions have some protection of the right to vote, and 26 of our state constitutions have some sort of a free, fair, and open election clause, which is what the Pennsylvania and North Carolina courts use to strike down their maps as unconstitutional. So there's definitely a road forward there. The same technology that makes it possible for scheming partisans to hijack our democratic process and to draw these deeply enduring advantages for themselves, that technology is being marshaled by citizens, mathematicians, reformers of all kinds, and they're using it to show just the kind of partisan outliers that these maps are. And that's been really effective as far as showing citizens that these maps are not fair. And it's been really effective as far as showing judges and courts. Again, I feel like it would be better if we had a national standard that didn't allow North Carolina and Pennsylvania to have fair maps, but not Georgia and Texas. That is not going to be the case. The other thing we have to really be on the lookout for as 2020 turns into 2021 is something called citizen voting age population. And that's important because in the past, the long-standing tradition in the country is to draw state legislative districts based on total population. That includes everybody. It includes folks who are citizens and non-citizens. It includes people who vote and don't vote. It includes people of voting age and those under the age of 18. And one of the things that the Republicans are working on, and you could see this in Hoffler's files, is trying to push as many of the states that they control right now to shift this process. Instead of using total population, to use citizen voting age population instead. And that naturally makes states whiter, older, more rural, and more conservative. And it's a dramatic shift of political power in state legislatures, especially state legislatures in places like Texas, like Arizona, states that have a population of immigrants and non-citizens. And that could really change the playing field for another couple of decades. So I think what we have to do is be really aware, because what has happened is that, and I think it's something you lay out in your book so well, is that there is a political party right now that has turned democracy into its own political football. And they've used it as an intentional strategy, putting up barriers between people and the right to vote. And that's not going to stop, because every time the courts or voters have tried to find a way around it, it's like playing whack-a-mole. Another problem emerges. So we have to be constantly vigilant. These challenges are not going to stop. Voting roll purges are not going to stop. Attempts to sort of game this system any way it can. It is up to us to be really, really eternally vigilant. These fights don't end with any one single election. We have to be engaged in this battle for the right to vote as something, as an engagement that is long and permanent.
Thank you, David. When I talk about things like voter ID laws with like normal people who are not obsessed with it, they usually respond with something like, well, of course you should have to show your ID to vote, because like, how are they going to know that that you're you or whatever? So I guess my question is, if you could help our audience understand why communities of color and other marginalized groups are especially impacted by voter suppression efforts like restrictive voter ID laws and other barriers to access, and then sort of how can we sort of fight back against those efforts and really engage in an effort to expand the voting rights for all Americans.
Let me share a story with you of a voter who called us in November 2016. He had recently become eligible to vote. He actually called us for what seemed like a kind of boring type of question of where is my polling place? I need help looking it up. Sure enough, when he tried to find out his polling place from the local election jurisdiction's website, he lives in a semi-rural area, and the way that his state road is, the way he was typing it in, he was doing everything right, but the system didn't recognize that unusual type non-standard address. So once we figured out, we got the precinct maps out and we figured out where is it that he is eligible to vote, we asked, okay, if you recently became eligible, are you on the voter rolls or do you need any help trying to navigate that? It turned out that he needed an ID that day in order to show that he was eligible. And he had a job, he had a photo ID from his job, but that was not considered sufficient. It didn't, like most of us, if we do have an ID for our workplace, it wouldn't have our home address on it, right? So he needed another kind of ID for his, for the purpose of voting. And he's Black, he had voted many years in the past, hadn't voted recently, had gone through housing challenges, had secured housing, didn't have documentation of that such that it made it that easy for him to register. He explained that he had actually been trying to get an ID well in advance of the election, and a couple of the items that he was told by the government agency that he needed in order to get his ID were a social security card or a birth certificate. He was born out of state in Minnesota, and he was not able to locate his social security card, again, having gone through housing and other transitions, and being in the criminal justice system. He tried to apply for a birth certificate from Minnesota, and he filled out the application. The notary public would not notarize his application because he didn't have a driver's license or state ID. So it just became this situation where he had been trying to address it well ahead of time and faced every kind of obstacle, even by trying to follow all of the rules. Actually, it was in an election jurisdiction that I was somewhat surprised was trying to help him and say, is there a way that we could get a fax from a previous parole officer, or trying to be really creative about what might fit here, and they just weren't able to get it done under the rules. And if that happens in a place where government officials are trying to be helpful but working within a certain set of constraints, imagine the horror stories that we get, like from my home state of Indiana or other places where the systems have been crafted in a way to either intentionally exclude people or under the guise of of reducing voter fraud or other myths that are perpetuated. There are even more restrictive policies in place. Again, when people call us on election day, the difference between whether they can vote or not often is about what their area code is and which state if they're calling us from Indiana or Illinois. In terms of even when we're talking about fully eligible voters, it's documented that they're eligible. The government has their paperwork already, but just another issue is when people move frequently, as it tends to happen more so in communities of color, low-income communities, people with disabilities. It can be a nightmare, even if you do have an ID, if you don't have a valid address on there. So again, it really depends on the place where someone lives about whether that's going to trip them up or not, and sometimes about whether they're able to get help from lawyers or other advocates or people who are willing to spell out the requirements. And that's unfortunate, because whether someone should get to enter the polling place or not shouldn't depend on whether they called a lawyer that day or whether they were able to go through all these complicated steps. So we definitely have to be vigilant about that as well. And it's even more reason for the need to push reforms like automatic voter registration. I get it. It doesn't cure everything, even in a state where you pass a law like that, but it has been increasingly approved on a bipartisan basis, and with the promise of hopefully cleaning up the voter rolls. And that way, it shouldn't be just when you get your driver's license that you could get registered through automatic voter registration. It should be when we get public benefits, when we apply for unemployment, other programs that our communities interact with, maybe across racial groups more so than the limited group of people who tend to get driver's licenses.
Thank you. So we have about 15 minutes left. So I wanted to open it up to our audience to ask questions of our panelists. I will say, I'm a little bit strict about this. So if you could please, we only have our panelists for a limited amount of time. If you could please get to your question as quickly as possible and not make a long comment before the question as much as that is humanly possible. I would really appreciate it. Okay, so now that I'm done with that, I will point to someone. Yes, sir.
Professor Faris, have these issues led to polarization that people complain about so much, that actually polarization has been driven by suppression? For Ami, are voter security laws going to be used to suppress the vote? And Daley, were the Democrats just hung over since 2008? Because I still can't understand why we're in this jam as a result of 2010 and 2011. Thank you.
Why don't we start at the end, David?
In March of 2010, Karl Rove writes an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in which he lays out exactly what the Republicans were going to do and where they were going to do it and what the effects were going to be. And it's the largest newspaper in the country, but I guess Democrats just don't read it. Or they didn't get their paper that day. Or the plan was sitting there in plain sight. Everybody knows what happens in a 0 year. The Democrats who I talked to for the book said they just whistled past the graveyard. They were overconfident at the demographic changes that were taking place in the country. And they thought that they were going to be a coalition that essentially was a majority coalition for a generation to come. And they fell asleep on the importance of these down ballot races in small states. And as a result, they really got it handed to them.
In Illinois, the bipartisan State Board of Elections has issued data. It's buried in the bottom of a report on their very user-unfriendly website, but it's there, and it shows that they've analyzed the data about voter fraud allegations and have concluded that, I think it was 2017 is when this research is dated, that voter fraud occurred 1,000th of 1% of all ballots cast in the state. As of their 2-year study, I think it was. And so I think it's really important to be fact-driven in this work, and my hope is that statewide and beyond, that we can together do a more effective job going forward of debunking the myths around voter fraud. And does it ever happen in Chicago or Illinois? Yes, it happens sometimes, an exceedingly rare number of times, and so let's be real with that. We have good opportunities to work with law enforcement on the tiny, minuscule number of cases that where that comes up, and then be real about the fact that normally that's not an issue at all. Now, election, I don't know if this is what you were asking about, but election security, while voter fraud is not a real issue, election security is a real issue. And there are a lot of important proposals on the table right now to strengthen the protection of election systems, to invest money and infrastructure for that. Actually, the Cook County Clerk's Office here locally has been a real thought leader in that space, and I think we have a lot to learn from their suggestions about election security, and I'm not saying just in Cook County, but nationally, they really have a lot of insight to offer. Honestly, because of some of the issues that happen in really hyper-local municipal elections in the Cook County suburbs. So they have a lot of incentive to try to restore faith, voter faith in our system, and so let's follow their lead about their suggestions about how to better secure our elections.
And so really quickly, I think the extent to which polarization is driven solely by gerrymandering itself, I think is a little bit overstated. But I do think that you see very clear effects of gerrymandering in Congress on sort of partisan extremism in our politics. And you can see that if you just look at charts of the number of swing seats in Congress. So in other words, the number of seats out of the 435 seats for Congress that are elected every 2 years, how many of them are close enough that they're reasonably could be considered competitive. And that number has declined sharply over the past 30 years to the point where there's really only 50 or 60 competitive seats out of 435 in the whole country, right? And so what that means practically speaking is that most members of Congress, instead of fearing their fate with the general election voters and instead of persuading the broader public and legislating in the interest of the broader public, the thing that they fear the most is the voters in their own party when it comes time to face a primary challenge, right? And I do think that the prevalence of partisan gerrymandering has produced, in many ways, a Congress in which the incentives facing our lawmakers are for them to please the most extreme members of their base, rather than legislating in the interest of the public good. And that's why I think the ideas that are out there right now about how to reform the districting process really could have, and not just, even in a broader sense about changing the whole way that we elect Congress, which is a conversation for another day. But I think that really has the potential to change the incentives for our elected officials and sort of change our politics for the better. So, yeah, sure.
Hello. So tonight we've talked a lot about gerrymandered legislators, how we can fix it through the courts, but I'd like to ask anyone on the stage to talk about each state's Secretary of State role in voter suppression and the way they can purge voting rolls and what effect that has on voting suppression, like, for example, Georgia in 2018.
I think you've answered your own question. It's crucial, it's very important. Secretary of State essentially administers the election. When they are administering their own election, that's sort of an extra layer of conflict of interest. And when they are going to administer their own election by closing down precincts and sort of surgically choosing which precincts to close, or determining how many machines go to which precinct and therefore how long the lines will be. And when they use a system like cross-check or one of the other systems that was in place in Georgia, exact match, in which, Stacey Abrams has a great line in which she talks about how my signature is not the same at Publix as it is at CVS, assigning a credit card slip from, one place to the next. So if your signature doesn't match, if your name doesn't match exactly because you've gotten married and changed your name, or because one ID has a middle initial and one ID doesn't, or there's just something spelled wrong. When that becomes a way to kick somebody off the voting rolls, and you don't know that you've been kicked off the voting rolls because maybe you got a postcard sent to your house that was intentionally designed to look like junk mail, or when the people who are kicked off voting rolls, as we saw in Georgia, were extraordinarily more likely to be black or to have a Latino last name, that you've got the potential for all kinds of electoral problems, especially in close races like the one you saw in Georgia, in which the Secretary of State wins the governor's election by, about 35,000 votes, and many more people than that were carefully knocked off the rolls.
I want to share an example close to home of something that's a bit of a happy story, which is that Illinois withdrew from the controversial cross-check program, I believe it was last year, in 2018. And this was after a long stretch of us participating in that program. In Illinois, it's a little bit different, where our bipartisan State Board of Elections serves kind of in that role similar to a Secretary of State's office, but the elections are super decentralized here, so we have over 100 local election jurisdictions, for better or worse. But there are some good things that come with it being decentralized, so that there's not one actor who's going to be able to do something nefarious like that, like the kind of purges we've heard about that are very real in other places. So, but bipartisan, it sounds good, but that's challenging too, because for Illinois to get out of cross-check, it had to be a majority affirmative vote, and that took a couple of years of advocacy for that to effectively happen, because it was a 4-4 deadlock for a long time, where along party lines, where there were 4 individuals of a certain party who did not want the state to get out of that program that, from a civil rights point of view, we argued was unfairly purging people of color from the rolls. So it took a sustained effort, and I would say the nonpartisan voice of ours helped in that, to continue, just keep supplying facts about why this is problematic to remove people from the polls in this manner, and eventually we're successful.
Other questions?
Hi, I was wondering if you could maybe comment or share your opinions on the notion of, or the conflict between the idea of universal suffrage and selective suffrage. You know, in America, it's selective. The court has ruled in 1974, Supreme Court, felons don't have the right to vote. They've sort of said this is a state's issue. It's not really a federal issue. You figure out districting. So is there any, I mean, I think I know how everyone in this room feels, you know, universal suffrage is the way to go, but is there any merit to that in the shape of our democracy, in the founding, and the way we built it from the get-go? Is there any merit to the notion that universal suffrage is not the way to go, and that the people who should be voting are the ones that are best positioned to care for and steward the country, and that isn't everybody, as the court has ruled?
I think we've seen examples time and time again of when our traditionally held beliefs about who should be part of the system and who should not have kind of fallen apart over time. And we see that locally and nationally. So I think it's on us to keep pushing for the narrative to be modernized. There is leeway, as you mentioned, for states to do things differently. And we see that in a couple handful of states, of Maine and Vermont, and a few other areas where they do things differently and people serving sentences are able to vote. So it takes a mental shift largely, and to be able to have the honesty to look back at our history and maybe the beliefs that we take as fundamental and challenge, well, why was it stated that way at that time, and what were the power structures that people were trying to preserve or push at that time, and to take a real look at where race falls into that discussion as well. Because I don't think there's a good connection between limiting people's right to vote in the manner, the criteria that we've chosen to impose as a government and as a society.
As an individual, I registered people to vote. So if I was going to do something as just me, is registering people to vote something that I can do, especially maybe in communities of color? I mean, besides calling my congressmen and senators, what can I do?
Registering people to vote is hugely important. And since I've had the dark cloud over my head for much of the last 75 minutes, let me try to turn that around for a second. Because one person can do an awful lot, and all you have to do is look at the state of Michigan. There was a young woman named Katie Fahey who, 2 days after the election in 2016, she woke up depressed, frustrated. She was afraid of what Thanksgiving was going to be like in her deeply divided house. Mashed potatoes were going to be in the air between Hillary and Trump voters. And she got up and she made a Facebook post, and she said, I want to do something about gerrymandering in Michigan. Do you want to join me? And then she added a smiley face emoji at the end of this. And maybe it was the emoji that did it. That Facebook post leads to the creation of Voters Not Politicians in Michigan. It marshals thousands of volunteers who go out and collect more than 400,000 signatures to put a constitutional amendment giving citizens control of redistricting in the state again. They raise $15 million, they go door to door, and they win. They defeat the biggest entrenched special interest in the state, the Chamber of Commerce, all the DeVos family throwing millions of dollars in to try to stop them. And this is what grew out of a Facebook post. So the idea that we can't do anything about these big structural problems is wrong, right? We talk a lot about Dr. King and the arc of moral justice being long, but bending towards justice. It bends towards justice when we grab it and push it and move it that way. And all of us have the power to do that.
I'll have to give a shout out to one of the phenomenal local organizations that people based here locally might want to get involved with, Chicago Votes, to either join them or support them in their incredible work to help people register to vote in Cook County Jail.
Okay. Well, we are, sadly, because I would like to continue this conversation myself, but we are out of time that we've been allotted for this. So I want to thank both of our panelists, Amit Gandhi and David Daley, for joining us here and sharing their insights with us today. So please give another round of applause to them. And President Roosevelt, yes.
For David Faris, Professor Faris, for putting this panel together and helping us with the programming for the American Dream throughout the academic year. Now, a couple of very quick comments. Being an immigrant from Iran, I thought we absolutely were #1 by having the worst election process in the world. Now I know North Carolina is beating us, so I'm really gratified for that piece of information. But, you know, I come back to David and Amit's point in terms of the only way for us to change the system if we don't like it is to vote. Okay? Whether that vote is diluted or not allowed to and so forth is really a technical matter, but we absolutely have to vote. And anytime I get tired on the day that I'm supposed to vote, and I say, maybe this Tuesday, no, so forth, I'm reminded of an NPR program I was listening to a few years back, and this young reporter was asking people in India, in a village, remote village, it was a hot day, people were standing in long lines to vote, and she happens to go to this elderly woman and says, you know, mother, you're standing in line for long hours, and, you know, why do you do this? And after translation, he came back, you know, I have no possessions in life, family that have passed away or moved on, I have no homes, I have nothing, I have one vote. Okay? So every time I think about not voting, honestly, that story comes to my mind, that as citizens, we absolutely have the obligation to vote and make sure our children vote and our neighbors vote and the registration so that we can get other people to vote. Thank you all for being here tonight. We continue all this great discussion tomorrow as well. So we'll see you in the next program. And thank you to the panelists one more time.